Grayson Wells gripped the steering wheel of his sleek black Aston Martin, the open road stretching before him like a challenge. He had spent the last 5 years building his tech company from the ground up, turning a small startup into a multimillion-dollar empire. But now, success felt suffocating. The board meetings, the endless demands, the artificial smiles at networking events, it all blurred together into something he no longer recognized. So, he had done what no one expected. He had packed a bag, left his assistant a vague email, and hit the road. No destination, no plan, just him, his car, and the freedom he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't supposed to pick anyone up. This was his escape, his time to be alone. But when he saw her, standing at the side of a nearly deserted highway, her thumb out, he found himself easing his foot off the gas. She looked lost, hair wild from the wind, clothes slightly wrinkled, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. There was something in her eyes, something defiant yet vulnerable, that made him pull over before he even realized what he was doing. She hesitated for a moment before approaching his car, peering inside cautiously. "You don't look like a serial killer," she muttered, then frowned. "Though I guess they never do." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "And you don't look like someone who should be hitchhiking," she sighed. "Yeah, well, desperate times." A flicker of curiosity stirred in him. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere but here." That was answer enough. Without another word, she opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, tossing her bag at her feet. As he pulled back onto the highway, curiosity gnawed at him. He didn't pick up strangers. He didn't deviate from his plans, except now he had no plans. "I'm Grayson," he offered. She glanced at him, then out the window. "Lena." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came when two people didn't need to fill the air with meaningless chatter. "You don't seem like the type to take road trips alone," Lena said after a while, her voice laced with curiosity. "You don't seem like the type to hitchhike." A slow smile played on her lips. "Touché." They drove for hours, passing small towns and endless stretches of road. Occasionally, she'd hum along to the radio, her voice soft, almost absent-minded. He found himself watching her out of the corner of his eye, intrigued by the way she seemed so at ease despite her circumstances. When they finally stopped at her roadside diner, she stretched as she climbed out of the car. "I haven't eaten in hours," she admitted, rubbing her stomach. Grayson chuckled. "Then let's fix that." Inside, the diner was nearly empty, the scent of coffee and grilled burgers thick in the air. They slid into a booth, and Lena wasted no time ordering a massive plate of pancakes. "You eat like you've been starving," he noted. She smirked. "Maybe I have." His curiosity deepened. "Running from something?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "More like leaving something behind." Grayson understood that feeling all too well. Same. Their eyes met, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what it was yet, but he knew one thing: this road trip had just become something much more than an escape. The hum of the highway stretched between them, the sky deepening from the soft pinks of dusk to the indigo hush of night. Lena had kicked off her shoes, tucking her feet onto the seat as she gazed out the window, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the glass. Grayson could feel the shift in the air, the quiet weight of things unsaid pressing against them. They had stopped at a gas station an hour ago, where she had insisted on picking out the snacks. Now she was munching on a bag of pretzels, offering him one without looking his way. He took it, more amused than hungry. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "are you going to tell me what exactly you're leaving behind?" Lena's expression flickered, but she didn't turn away from the window. "That depends." "Are you going to tell me why you're on the road alone?" he exhaled, gripping the wheel a little tighter. "I needed to get away." She shot him a sideways glance. "That's vague." "So was your answer." A small smirk tugged at her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She rolled the pretzel bag closed and set it on the dashboard. Fair enough. Grayson didn't push. He knew what it was like to have things you weren't ready to say aloud. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, the rhythmic lines on the asphalt hypnotic in the glow of his headlights. Eventually, Lena shifted, stretching her arms before resting her head against the window. You know, I didn't plan on hitchhiking. He arched a brow. And yet there you were, she let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, well, plans change. One minute, you think you have your whole life mapped out, and the next, you're standing on the side of the road, realizing none of it makes sense anymore. There was something raw in her voice, something that made his chest tighten. He didn't know her story yet, but he understood that feeling all too well. There's a motel up ahead, he said instead, spotting the neon vacancy sign glowing in the distance. We should stop for the night, she nodded, rubbing her arms as if shaking off a thought. Yeah. That sounds good. The motel was the kind that had seen better days, but it was clean, and that was enough. Grayson paid for 2 rooms, ignoring the way the woman at the front desk gave them a knowing look. Lena took the key he handed her, running her thumb over the worn plastic tag. Thanks, don't mention it. She hesitated for a second before tilting her head toward the vending machines near the lobby. I think I need something sweet after all those pretzels, Grayson smirked. You and your snacks. She grinned, and for a moment she looked younger, lighter. It's a survival skill. They walked over, the hum of the machines filling the quiet. She studied the selection like it was a life-altering decision before finally pressing a button. A chocolate bar tumbled down and she retrieved it with a triumphant little nod. "Want half?" she asked, already breaking it in 2. Grayson took the piece she offered without a word. They didn't speak as they ate, the night settling around them in a comfortable lull. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "I left my fiancé." Grayson's chewing slowed. He hadn't expected that, not tonight, not so bluntly. Lena exhaled, rolling the wrapper between her fingers. I was supposed to marry him in a month. Everything was planned. The dress, the venue, even the stupid seating chart. She let out a dry laugh. But then I woke up one morning and realized I couldn't do it. He studied her carefully. Why? Her lips pressed together. Because I couldn't stand the idea of spending the rest of my life with someone who saw me as an afterthought. Grayson didn't respond immediately. He had spent years surrounded by people who only saw him for what he could offer: his success, his connections, his money. He knew what it felt like to be valued for the wrong reasons. So you walked away, Lena nodded. Packed a bag and left before I could talk myself out of it. There was something fierce in her voice, but beneath it, he sensed the fracture lines, the tiny cracks she was trying to ignore. You're braver than you think, he said finally. She blinked as if she hadn't expected that. Then a small smile tugged at her lips. You don't even know me. No, he admitted. But I know what it's like to walk away from something that's slowly killing you. For a moment, they just stood there, the vending machine humming behind them, the neon motel sign flickering in the distance. Then, as if deciding something, Lena reached for his hand, giving it a brief squeeze before pulling away. Good night, Grayson. And just like that, she turned and walked toward her room, leaving him standing there with the taste of chocolate still lingering on his tongue and the ghost of her touch burning against his skin. Grayson woke to the soft sound of rain tapping against the motel window. He blinked against the early morning light filtering through the thin curtains, stretching the stiffness from his body. Something about the past 24 hours felt different, like an invisible shift he couldn't quite name. Lena. He sat up, dragging a hand through his hair. She was still a mystery, but one he wanted to understand. There was something about her, something unpolished, real, unexpected. She wasn't like the women he usually encountered, the ones who saw his wealth before they saw him. She had no idea who he was, and for the first time in years, someone was looking at him without expectation. A soft knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Lena standing there, a takeaway cup balanced in each hand. "Figured you might need caffeine," she said, offering him one. He took it, the warmth seeping into his fingers. "You bribing me into driving you further," she smirked. "Maybe, that depends. Am I still invited?" Grayson didn't hesitate. "Yeah." They packed up and hit the road again, the rain turning into a misty drizzle as they drove. The landscape blurred past, vast and open, stretching endlessly ahead. Lena had her feet propped on the dashboard, flipping through a worn paperback she must have picked up at the motel. Every so often, she'd hum a few lines of a song playing softly through the speakers. It was easy, the silence between them, comfortable. "You ever get tired of it?" she asked suddenly, not looking up from her book. Grayson glanced at her. "Tired of what? Having everything?" He didn't answer right away. Most people assumed money solved everything, that success erased all the cracks, but it didn't. "Sometimes," he admitted. Lena finally looked over, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "So why keep chasing it?" It was a question no one had ever asked him. Not like that. He thought about the years he had spent building his company, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices. He had once believed that reaching a certain level of success would make him feel something, whole, complete. But instead, he had built an empire only to realize he felt more lost than ever. "It's not about the money," he said finally. "It's about proving something." "To who?" Grayson tightened his grip on the wheel. "My father." Lena didn't press, just watched him like she was piecing together a puzzle. "My mother left when I was a kid," he continued, surprising himself. He never talked about this. "My father was a businessman, ruthless. He believed love was a weakness. So I spent years trying to prove I could be just as strong as him. That I didn't need anyone either." Lena studied him for a long moment. "And did it work?" he exhaled, a humorless laugh escaping. "Not really." She nodded, as if she understood more than he was saying. They drove in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation lingering. Then Lena shifted, stretching her arms. "Okay, enough heavy stuff, let's play a game." Grayson arched a brow. "A game?" "Yeah, rapid-fire questions, no overthinking, just answer," he smirked. "All right." She tapped her chin, then pointed at him. "Favorite food?" "Steak." "Biggest fear?" "Failure." Her expression softened, but she didn't linger on it. "Dream vacation?" "Somewhere quiet." Lena grinned. "You're terrible at this, that's not specific at all," he shrugged. "All right, fine, a cabin in the mountains, no phone, no meetings." "Just peace." She nodded approvingly. "Now we're getting somewhere." They kept going, moving through light-hearted questions, winding through small towns and empty roads. The further they went, the more Grayson felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. He wasn't used to this. Not the simplicity, not the ease. By the time they reached a small roadside diner for dinner, the sky had turned a deep shade of violet. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee and grilled food. They slid into a booth, Lena scanning the menu while Grayson took in the quiet hum of the place. "So," she said, setting the menu down, "where are we going next?" He leaned back, considering. "That depends. How far are you willing to go?" Lena tilted her head. "How far do you need to go to figure out what you're looking for?" Grayson didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. But as he watched her across the table, something in him whispered that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't meant to find it alone. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the glow of the setting sun spilling golden light over the horizon. Grayson drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gear shift, fingers idly tapping. Lena sat beside him, her bare feet tucked beneath her, eyes half-lidded as she watched the world blur past. They had been driving for hours, stopping only when hunger or exhaustion demanded it. Somewhere along the way, the miles had stopped feeling like distance, and started feeling like something else, something weightless and free, as if time had unraveled and left only them. Lena reached out, tracing the cool leather of the dashboard with a fingertip. "We should stop somewhere soon," she murmured, a soft weariness in her voice. Grayson glanced at her, taking in the way her hair had fallen loose from its earlier braid, the way the fading light caught in her eyes. "You tired?" she smiled, but there was something thoughtful behind it. "Not really, just, I don't want this to feel like we're running." His fingers tightened slightly on the wheel. He understood exactly what she meant. They had spent days chasing open roads, avoiding questions that neither of them wanted to answer. But what happened when the road ran out? Up ahead, a small town flickered into view. It wasn't much, just a scattering of buildings, the glow of streetlights flickering on as night settled in. A weathered sign pointed toward a boutique inn, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Without thinking too much about it, Grayson slowed the car and pulled in. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as he parked, cutting the engine. Lena stretched, then turned to him, a teasing glint in her gaze. "A real bed, you're spoiling me," he smirked. "Figured you deserved an upgrade from motel sheets." The inn was quiet, the scent of lavender and aged wood greeting them as they stepped inside. A woman at the front desk handed over the keys, barely sparing them a glance before returning to her book. Grayson carried both their bags without question, leading the way up the narrow staircase. The hallway was dimly lit, the wooden floor creaking beneath their steps. Lena's room was first. She unlocked the door, then lingered in the doorway, looking at him as if she wasn't quite ready to let the night end. He leaned against the frame, studying her. "You okay?" she nodded, but there was something else there, something quiet and unspoken. "Yeah." Neither of them moved. The space between them felt charged, humming with something that had been building since the moment she slid into his car. Then, as if deciding something, Lena took a step forward. Grayson didn't move away. Her fingers brushed against the front of his shirt, barely there, but enough to set his pulse hammering. He caught her wrist gently, holding it for a moment before pulling her hand against his chest. "Lena," he murmured, her name heavy on his tongue. She exhaled softly, her fingers curling against the fabric. "Tell me this isn't just the road getting to us." His grip tightened just slightly. "It's not." And then she kissed him. It wasn't hesitant, wasn't careful. It was the kind of kiss that unraveled something deep inside, that tore through the walls they had both spent years building. Grayson pulled her closer, his hand sliding to the small of her back, anchoring her against him. When they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his, breath uneven. "What happens when we stop running?" she whispered. Grayson cupped her face, tracing his thumb along her cheekbone. "Then we stop." Her eyes searched his, looking for something, maybe reassurance, maybe certainty. Whatever it was, she must have found it, because she nodded, a small, almost relieved smile curving her lips. "Stay?" she asked, the word barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The road would still be there tomorrow. But tonight, they weren't running from anything. The early morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. Grayson stirred first, his senses waking before his eyes did. The soft scent of lavender lingered in the air, mingling with the faint trace of Lena's perfume. He shifted slightly, feeling her warmth beside him, her bare shoulder peeking from beneath the blanket. For the first time in years, the weight that usually clung to his chest was absent. It wasn't the kind of fleeting relief that came from escaping responsibilities for a few days. This was something different, something deeper. Lena stirred, her fingers brushing absently against his forearm before her eyes fluttered open. She blinked at him, a slow smile forming as she stretched. "Morning." He traced a lazy pattern over the curve of her hip beneath the sheets. "Morning." She studied him for a beat, something contemplative in her gaze. "You look different." "Different how?" A soft hum left her lips as she considered. "Lighter." Grayson didn't know how to respond to that. He had spent so long carrying the weight of expectations his father's, his own, that the idea of feeling lighter was foreign. But maybe, just maybe, she was right. Lena slipped from the bed, wrapping the blanket around herself as she padded toward the window. Outside, the small town was waking up, shopkeepers setting out signs, people strolling down the quiet streets. The world felt untouched here, unhurried. She glanced back at him, her expression suddenly serious. "What happens when we leave here?" Grayson sat up, resting his arms on his knees. He had been asking himself the same question since the moment she fell asleep beside him. "That depends. Do you want to keep going?" Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the curtain. "And if I said yes," he didn't hesitate, "then we keep going." Something flickered in her eyes, hope, uncertainty, maybe both, but she nodded as if making a silent agreement with herself. They showered, dressed, packed their bags, and checked out of the inn without a word about where they were headed next. It didn't matter. The road had become its own kind of destination. Back in the car, Lena pulled her knees up, resting her chin on them as she gazed out at the open highway. "Tell me something you've never told anyone before." Grayson exhaled through his nose, considering. "I used to think success would make me immune to loneliness." She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "And now?" His fingers tightened on the wheel. "Now I know it doesn't work like that." Lena didn't say anything right away. Instead, she reached over, lacing her fingers through his. It was a simple gesture, but it grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. They drove for hours, stopping only when hunger demanded it. A roadside diner with faded red booths became their midday refuge. They ordered without thinking too much about it, the familiarity between them settling deeper. As they waited for their food, Lena leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. "What happens when you go back?" Grayson met her gaze, knowing exactly what she meant. His company, his responsibilities, the life he had built was still waiting. But for the first time, the thought of returning didn't feel like a noose tightening around his throat. His thumb traced slow circles against her palm. "I don't know, but I do know I don't want to go back without you." Lena's breath hitched slightly, but she didn't pull away. "And if I'm not ready?" "Then I wait." His voice was steady, certain. "I don't want this to end when the road does." She searched his face, looking for something, maybe reassurance, maybe proof that this wasn't just another fleeting escape. Whatever it was, she must have found it because she nodded, her fingers tightening around his. The food arrived, but neither of them touched it right away. The moment between them felt heavier than any meal could interrupt. Lena exhaled slowly. "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you." Grayson smirked slightly. "I could say the same about you." She shook her head. "No, I mean it. You're not just saying what you think I want to hear, you actually mean it." "I do." That was the thing about Lena, she had a way of making him want to be honest, to strip away the carefully constructed layers he had spent years building. They finished their meal, paid the check, and got back on the road, but something had shifted between them. It wasn't just a road trip anymore, it wasn't just an escape, it was something more. As the miles stretched ahead, Lena reached over, intertwining their fingers once more. And for the first time in his life, Grayson wasn't chasing something he couldn't name. He had already found it. The city skyline came into view just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting streaks of amber and violet across the sky. Grayson maneuvered through the streets with practiced ease, though his grip on the wheel was tighter than usual. Lena sat beside him, her posture relaxed, but her gaze flicked between the towering buildings, taking in the pulse of a world so different from the quiet roads they had traveled. Neither of them had spoken much since crossing into the city limits. The weight of reality pressed against them, unspoken but present. The road had been theirs endless, free, without expectation. But this was his world, the one he had built, the one she had left behind. Grayson pulled into the underground parking garage of his penthouse, the hum of the engine cutting off as he turned to her. "You don't have to do this," he said, searching her face. Lena met his gaze, something unreadable in her expression. "I know." And yet she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out. Inside, the penthouse was as pristine as he had left it, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the glittering city below, sleek modern furniture untouched by time. But it felt different now. Colder. Lena wandered in, her fingers grazing the edge of a marble counter as she took everything in. Grayson had never cared about the space before. It had been a place to sleep, to work, to exist. But now he saw it through her eyes' sharp edges, calculated luxury, a place that looked lived in but never truly felt like home. "You're staring," she murmured, turning to face him. Grayson exhaled, stepping closer. "I was just wondering what you're thinking," she gave him a small, knowing smile. "That this doesn't feel like you," he froze, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Lena motioned around the room. "This, all of it. It's beautiful, sure, but it feels like something you built because you thought you were supposed to. Not because you wanted it." Grayson had spent years making decisions based on necessity, on strategy. But Lena. She had walked away from something that didn't feel right, even when it had been the easier choice to stay. And now, here she was, seeing him in a way no one else ever had. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen. Work. He let it ring. Lena arched an eyebrow. "Not going to answer?" "No." His voice was firm, certain. "Not tonight." Her expression softened, and something in the air shifted. The weight of everything, the road, the choices, the unspoken words hung between them. Grayson reached for her, his fingers brushing against hers. "Stay." Lena's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. "And then what?" "Then we figure it out." He cupped her face, his thumb tracing the delicate line of her jaw. "Together." She searched his eyes as if looking for something she wasn't sure she would find. Then, slowly, she nodded. And just like that, the road wasn't something they were leaving behind. It was something they were continuing, together. A few weeks later, the penthouse looked different, warmer, lived in. Grayson stood in the kitchen, watching as Lena moved effortlessly around, barefoot, humming absent-mindedly as she poured coffee. A soft morning light spilled through the windows, casting everything in a golden hue. He had never thought of this place as home before, but now it was. Lena turned, catching him watching her. A slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. "You're staring again." Grayson smirked, stepping forward to wrap his arms around her waist. "Get used to it." She laughed, leaning into him, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. And for the first time in his life, Grayson Wells wasn't chasing something he couldn't name. He had already found it.